The night Sylvie Tate saved a dog's life and lost her job happened to be the same night 22. Navy SEALs drove 4 hours across 2 counties to walk through the front doors of Coastal Regional Medical Center in Jacksonville, North Carolina. But Sylvie didn't know that yet. She was still crouched on the cold linoleum of the ER entrance bay, her gloves already soaked through, her hands pressing hard against a wound that had no business being inside a building like this. The dog's name was Scout. He was a Belgian Malinois, 83 pounds of lean muscle, a tan and black tactical vest strapped around his torso, his breathing shallow and fast and wrong in the way that told Sylvie everything she needed to know before she'd even asked a single question. He'd been brought in at 11:42 p.m. by a young corporal named Jesse Mack, who had driven straight from the base gate to the hospital without stopping. Because the nearest veterinary emergency clinic was 40 minutes away, and Scout had already lost a dangerous amount of blood from a deep laceration along his right foreleg, almost certainly from a chain-link fence during a night training exercise that had gone sideways. He's a military working dog. Mac had said at the entrance, out of breath, Scout cradled against his chest like a child. He got caught on the perimeter fence. I didn't know where else to go. Sylvie hadn't paused. She'd pulled on gloves from the supply cart by the door, called for gauze, saline, a suture kit, the portable light, and had gotten down on her knees right there in the entrance bay before anyone had said yes or no, or wait a moment, or let me check with someone. That was how Sylvie Tate operated. She had been a nurse for 6 years, the last 3 of them in the ER at Coastal Regional, and in that time she had learned that the window between stable and critical was narrower than most people imagined, and that hesitation was the thing that killed. Scout's eyes found hers when she pressed down on the wound and held. They were amber, wide, and despite everything, despite the pain that had to be screaming through his body, they were calm, alert, trusting, in that specific and gutting way that dogs had of trusting people even when people had given them no particular reason to. Sylvie pressed harder. "I've got you," she said, and she meant it. Mac crouched across from her, one hand resting on Scout's head, murmuring the dog's name over and over. He was maybe 24. His hands were shaking. Sylvie noticed that he was still in full tactical gear, face camo and everything, and she had the distinct thought that he'd run out of that training exercise the second Scout went down and hadn't stopped moving since. An aide brought the suture kit. Sylvie worked fast, cleaning the wound, irrigating it, assessing the depth. The laceration had torn through the outer tissue but hadn't nicked the bone. Scout would need real veterinary follow-up, but the bleeding could be controlled. Could be controlled right now, in this building, by her hands, if everyone would just let her do it. She was halfway through the first set of sutures when she heard heels on the linoleum behind her. "Nurse Tate!" The voice belonged to Harriet Weil, Administrative Director of Coastal Regional Medical Center, a position she had held for 11 years, and exercised with the precise and relentless energy of someone who had confused rule enforcement with leadership. She was 51, silver-haired, dressed in a blazer at midnight in the way that certain administrators always seemed to be dressed, as though the building itself required it. Sylvie didn't look up. "Give me 4 minutes. This is not a veterinary facility. I know what it is." Then you understand that treating an animal on these premises is a violation of our operating charter, our liability policy, and... "He's bleeding out," Sylvie said, her voice flat, her eyes still on Scout. "If I stop now, he'll go into shock before anyone gets him somewhere else. I need 4 minutes. There was a silence. Sylvie heard Mac inhale sharply. Nurse Tate. Weil's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. That was one of her signatures. She never raised her voice, never had to. "I need you to step away from the animal and report to the administrator's office. Immediately." Sylvie tied off the suture, started the next one, "After I finish." She heard Weil speak to someone behind her. The charge nurse on duty, it sounded like, and then footsteps, and then the particular quality of silence that filled a room when people were watching something unfold and had decided, collectively, to let it unfold without them. Sylvie understood that silence. She'd worked in enough hospitals to recognize it. It was the silence of people who had mortgages, who had kids in school, who had worked too hard to get where they were, to risk it on someone else's fight. She didn't blame them. She didn't have time to blame them. She finished the sutures, secured a proper pressure bandage, checked Scout's gum color, pale pink, not white, which was something. His breathing had steadied. She pressed 2 fingers against the inside of his foreleg and found the pulse still strong. "Okay," she said quietly, to Scout and to Mac both. "He needs fluids and he needs rest and he needs a vet, but he's stable. You understand? He's stable right now." Mac's eyes were wet. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Sylvie stood up. Harriet Weil was 3 feet away. Behind her stood 2 members of hospital security, not aggressive, just present, which was its own kind of statement. "Nurse Tate," Weil said, "I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending termination proceedings. Please surrender your badge and your access card." The ER had gone quiet enough that Sylvie could hear the monitors down the hall. She looked at Weil for a long moment. Then she reached up, unclipped the badge from her lanyard, and held it out. "He would have died," Sylvie said. Weil took the badge. "That's not our liability." "He served 3 combat deployments." That was Mac, suddenly, his voice cracking at the edges. "Scout has 3 combat deployments and 4 commendations, and he's been my partner for 2 years, and I didn't have anywhere else to." "Sir," Weil said, with the particular firmness of someone used to cutting people off at institutional thresholds, "I'm going to need you and your dog to exit the premises. If the animal requires further care, I can have someone provide you with a list of local veterinary facilities." She turned back to Sylvie. "Security will escort you out." The 2 guards didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Sylvie walked between them through the ER, past the nurse's station, where 4 people stood watching, and not one of them spoke, past the waiting room, where a woman with a toddler on her lap looked up briefly and then looked away, through the automatic doors and out into the parking lot. The night air hit her like cold water. November in Jacksonville had teeth. She stood on the sidewalk outside the entrance bay and listened to the doors slide shut behind her. Her car keys were in her locker. She'd been on a 12-hour shift. She'd come in at noon, worked through dinner, through the usual chaos of a Friday night ER, and she'd left her coat and her keys and her phone charger in locker 17, same as she always did. And now she was standing outside in scrubs, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the smell of Scout's blood on her gloves, which she was still wearing because she'd had no reason to take them off. She peeled them off now, dropped them in the bio-waste bin by the door. She didn't go back inside. She didn't know what she would have said, or done, or whether she was capable of saying or doing anything right now that wasn't going to make everything worse. So she walked to the edge of the parking lot instead and sat down on the concrete curb under a sodium light and looked at the cars. Inside, through the glass of the entrance bay, she could see the orderlies moving around Scout. Mac was still crouched beside him. Someone had gotten a blanket. She couldn't tell if it was genuine care or just damage control. The optics of a wounded dog and a distressed soldier in a hospital lobby were bad. Even Weil would know that. Sylvie watched Scout's chest rise and fall. She had not cried yet, and she was not going to cry now, she decided, and she sat there in the cold and the parking lot light and felt the particular kind of stillness that comes after the adrenaline burns off and leaves nothing behind but the shape of what just happened. She'd been a nurse for 6 years. She'd had difficult supervisors before. She'd been written up twice. Once for arguing with a doctor about a medication dosage she had turned out to be right about, and once for staying past her shift to sit with a patient who had no family. She had never in 6 years been escorted out of a building. She had also never let someone bleed out while she stood 3 feet away and watched. So there it was. That was the math. She heard the dogs first, or rather, she heard Scout react before she understood what he was reacting to. A single sharp bark from inside the lobby, and then Mac's voice, surprised, saying something she couldn't make out through the glass. Then she saw the headlights. 3 black vehicles turned into the hospital parking lot. 2 SUVs, and what looked like a government-issue pickup truck, moving in the unhurried and deliberate way of people who were accustomed to arriving somewhere and having that arrival mean something. They parked in a row in the main lot, not in the designated spots, just directly in the middle of the lane because they clearly were not concerned about being towed. The doors opened. Men climbed out. Big men, most of them in civilian clothes, but with the particular bearing that civilian clothes couldn't hide. The straightness, the economy of motion, the way they scanned the lot before they moved. Sylvie counted. She counted again. There were more than she'd expected. 14, 15. She lost count when they started moving toward the entrance. The last vehicle door opened, and a man stepped out who was not in civilian clothes. He was in dress uniform, navy, the kind with gold stripes at the cuff that meant a long career and a great deal of authority. He was in his early 60s, square-jawed, with white hair cut military short, and he walked with the deliberate and unhurried stride of someone who had never once in his life needed to hurry to make a point. Sylvie stood up. He saw her before he reached the entrance, registered her scrubs, the name tag slot on her chest that was now empty, her bare lanyard. He stopped. "Are you the nurse?" he said. "I'm the former nurse," Sylvie said, "as of about 20 minutes ago." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. "Commander Leonard Taft," he said, "SEAL Team 7, Naval Special Warfare Command. Scout has been with our unit for 4 years. He paused. "Mac called us from the car on the way over. We drove up from Virginia Beach." Sylvie looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the group of men now gathered near the entrance, waiting with the patience of people who had done a great deal of waiting in difficult places and had long since made their peace with it. "He's stable," she said. "The wound is sutured and the bleeding is controlled. He needs a vet, but he's stable." Taft held her gaze. "You did that?" "Yes. And they fired you for it." "Suspended pending termination. There's a distinction." He nodded once. Then he turned toward the entrance and walked through the automatic doors, and the men behind him followed, and Sylvie stood in the parking lot for exactly 3 seconds before she followed too. The ER lobby had been doing a moderate Friday night business before all this started. 2 people with minor lacerations, a woman waiting on chest x-ray results, an older man sleeping under a blanket in the corner. All of that had rearranged itself to accommodate the fact that there were now 16 or 17 men in civilian clothes fanning out quietly across the space, plus one man in a navy dress uniform, standing in the center of the lobby with his hands behind his back, looking at Harriet Weil. Weil had come back down from the administrative wing. She was still composed. Sylvie had to grant her that. "Can I help you?" Weil said. "Commander Leonard Taft," he said again. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. That dog on the floor served with SEAL Team 7 in 3 combat theaters over 4 years of active duty. He was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal and 2 unit commendations. He is considered an active service asset under Joint Publication 318. He looked at Weil without particular aggression or heat. It was something more unnerving than that. It was patience. "I understand you terminated a member of your nursing staff for treating his wounds. This hospital's liability policies." "I'm not interested in your liability policies, ma'am." Still calm. Still patient. "I'm interested in the fact that a nurse made a clinical decision to save the life of a decorated service animal and you escorted her out of the building for it." "A beat. I'm going to ask you to call your board chairman. Tonight. Now, if possible." That's not a request I'm in a position to." "His name is Gerald Foss. I have his personal cell number. I've spoken to him before when this hospital was being considered for the Veteran Outreach Program. If you'd like, I can place that call myself." The lobby was very quiet. Weil's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked at the men spread around the room, the ones by the entrance, the ones near the nurse's station, the ones positioned with the particular, natural ease of people who position themselves by training and didn't have to think about it anymore. She looked at Commander Taft. She looked briefly at Sylvie standing near the door. "I'll make the call," Weil said. She went to the elevator. The lobby breathed. Mac looked up from Scout's side. He found Sylvie across the room, and he looked like a person who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time and was only now starting to believe that he could let it go a little. Sylvie crossed the lobby and crouched down. Scout lifted his head when she got close. His amber eyes found her face the way they had in the entrance bay, that specific alert recognition, and then he did something that made two of the SEALs standing nearby go very quiet. He pressed his nose against her wrist and held it there. "Hey," Sylvie said softly, "I told you I had you." His tail moved once against the blanket. She checked the bandage, dry, holding, no seepage. She checked his eyes, his gums, his pulse. Everything was where it needed to be. She felt Taft come to stand nearby and looked up. "He needs veterinary care tonight," she said. "The sutures will hold, but he needs fluids, probably antibiotics, and the wound needs to be properly assessed by someone with the right imaging equipment. The tear looked clean, but I couldn't rule out deeper damage on feel alone. We have a vet on call at the base. We'll transport him as soon as you clear it." Another 40 minutes with the bandage stable, and I'd feel better about the drive. He's been through a lot tonight. Taft nodded. He crouched down too, not easily, with the practiced difficulty of a man whose body had given him a long list of complaints over the years, and put one hand on Scout's head. The dog's tail moved again. 4 years, Taft said, not really to Sylvie, not really to anyone. Afghanistan twice, Somalia. Every man on that team has a story about Scout, and most of them aren't fit for civilian company. He looked at the dog for a moment. He doesn't trust easily. Sylvie glanced down at the dog's nose, still resting against her wrist. Apparently, he makes exceptions. Taft looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted from the command voice gravity he'd carried through the doors into something quieter. "What happened tonight shouldn't have happened," he said. "And I intend to make sure the right people understand that. You don't have to do that on my account." "Nurse Tate," he said her name plainly. "You got on your knees on a cold hospital floor in the middle of the night to save a dog's life. You lost your job for it. And then you came back inside anyway to make sure he was okay." He paused. "That is exactly the kind of thing we intend to do something about." Sylvie didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at Scout, at Mac's hand still steady on the dog's shoulder, at the men around the lobby who had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night because one of their own was hurt and the person who had helped him had been punished for it. "He would have died," she said again. Not to Weil this time, not as an argument. Just as the truth of the thing, the simple and unambiguous fact that had been true at 11:42 p.m. and would still be true no matter what happened next. "We know," Taft said. Gerald Foss, the board chairman of Coastal Regional Medical Center, arrived at the hospital at 1:15 in the morning. He was a heavy-set man in his late 60s who had clearly been pulled from sleep and was doing his best to collect himself in the elevator ride up. Because by the time he came through the lobby, he had managed a jacket over his pajama shirt and a look of controlled alarm that Sylvie suspected he wore whenever the hospital's name appeared in contexts that made him uneasy. The conversation between Fossey, Taft, and the hospital's overnight legal representative took place in the small conference room off the administrative wing. Sylvie was not part of it. She sat in the lobby with Scout and Mac and the ambient presence of 14 off-duty Navy SEALs who had collectively decided to wait, which they did with the uncanny patience of their profession, some of them sitting, some of them standing, all of them quiet. One of them, a young man with a scar along his jaw and the easy posture of someone who had been in worse waiting rooms than this, sat down on the floor next to Mac after a while and said, "He looks better." "He is better," Mac said. She fixed him. The man with the scar looked at Sylvie. "You work here?" "I did," Sylvie said. He nodded slowly, with the comprehension of someone who had already been briefed on the relevant facts. "Taft'll fix that." She wasn't sure she believed him, but she appreciated the certainty with which he said it. At 2:07 a.m., the door to the conference room opened. Foss came out first, followed by the legal representative, followed by Taft, who had the same expression he'd had walking in, steady, patient, resolved. Foss crossed the lobby. He stopped in front of Sylvie. "Mrs. Tate," he said, "the board will be convening an emergency session at 9 o'clock this morning to review the circumstances of your termination. You will be placed on paid administrative leave pending that review, effective immediately. Your badge and access will be reinstated tonight." He paused. "I want to express personally my regret at the way this situation was handled." Sylvie looked at him. Then she looked past him at the door to the conference room, where Harriet Weil had appeared in the frame and was standing with her arms at her sides, her face unreadable. "What happens to her?" Sylvie said. Fosse glanced back. "That will be determined in the review." It wasn't a satisfying answer. Sylvie had lived long enough to know that institutional justice moved slowly and often sideways, and sometimes not at all. But she also knew that Taft had Gerald Fosse's personal cell number and had used it at 2 in the morning without hesitation, and that 14 Navy SEALs had sat quietly in this lobby for over an hour, because someone they trusted had decided this mattered, and that sometimes things that happened slowly happened surely. She nodded. Someone pressed her badge into her hand. She looked down at it, her name, her photo, the blue lanyard clip. She put it back around her neck. Scout was transported to the base veterinary facility at 2:30 a.m. Mac went with him. Before they loaded him into the back of one of the SUVs, carefully on a backboard with the blanket tucked around him, Scout lifted his head one more time and looked across the parking lot to where Sylvie was standing. She raised one hand. His tail moved. The emergency board review took place as scheduled at 9 o'clock that morning. Sylvie drove home at 3, slept for 4 hours, and came back in a clean set of scrubs with her lanyard around her neck. By 10:30, she had a written determination in her hand stating that her actions on the night of November 15th had been found to be consistent with the core obligations of patient care as understood by the institution. That her employment was fully reinstated with no record of disciplinary action, and that the administrative director position currently held by Harriet Weil would be undergoing a formal performance evaluation. The nursing staff of the ER found out what had happened in the way that hospital staff always found out things. Through the overnight shift, through the charge nurse who'd been on duty, through the aide who'd brought the suture kit and watched the whole thing unfold from start to finish. By the time Sylvie came back in for her afternoon shift, the locker room had gotten very quiet when she walked in, and then one of the newer nurses, a woman named Beth, who'd been working at Coastal Regional for 8 months, said, "I should have said something last night. I'm sorry." Sylvie put her bag in locker 17. "You can say something next time." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a door left open, which was the best she could offer right now. She worked a full shift that afternoon. The ER was steady. 2 minor traumas, a respiratory case, a kid with a dislocated shoulder who cried for 10 minutes and then asked if he could have a popsicle and got one. Routine. The good ordinary rhythm of a day where things stayed manageable. At 6 o'clock, Mac sent a text to the number she'd given him through one of Taft's men. "Scout is doing well. Vet says the sutures are clean. He'll need a few weeks, but he's going to be fine. He kept looking for you this morning. I think he was confused about where you went." Sylvie read it twice. Then she wrote back, "Tell him I didn't go anywhere. Tell him I'm still here." She stood for a moment by the nurse's station, her badge clipped to her lanyard, the ER moving around her in its ordinary nighttime way, the monitors beeping, the gurney wheels, someone down the hall asking for blankets, someone else laughing at something. The particular living texture of a place where people came when they were most afraid and needed someone to tell them it was going to be okay. This was what she'd chosen, 6 years ago and every day since. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and went back to work.